She was the villain. She was the third person in the marriage. She needed to rehabilitate her image. We thought that it was going to cause more harm than good.
He was the man quietly written out of one of the most infamous royal love stories in modern history. For decades, Andrew Parker Bowles stayed silent, watching from the sidelines as Camilla became queen, and the world embraced a narrative he knew wasn't the full truth. But now, his voice has emerged, not with scandal, but with something far more powerful: clarity. What really happened behind the scenes of Britain's most talked about triangle? And what did Camilla sacrifice on her way to the crown? Their marriage, like many others in those circles, appeared to follow the same path: proper, respectable, and at times, quietly strained. When they separated in 1995, most people accepted the official version of events without much thought. They'd grown apart, and Camilla had already begun moving toward her long-standing connection with Prince Charles. At the time, it didn't spark much public curiosity. It looked like a dignified end to a high-society marriage. But nearly 30 years later, that quiet ending is being revisited. In a rare and unexpected turn, Andrew Parker Bowles has spoken out, albeit privately, through a leaked conversation that's now reached the media. Known for being reserved and loyal, particularly when it came to the royal family, Andrew had largely kept silent throughout the years. He never gave interviews, never published a tell-all, and certainly never sought attention. But according to those familiar with the recent leak, he felt compelled to correct what he sees as an inaccurate version of the past that has taken root in public memory. "I didn't leave because of Charles," he reportedly said. "I could have lived with Charles. I couldn't live with Camilla as she became." The quote surprised many, not just because it came from Andrew, a man known for keeping things close to the chest, but because of the unexpected honesty in his words. This wasn't bitterness or an attempt at revenge. It was, in his own words, a response to history being repeatedly written the wrong way. For decades, the narrative surrounding his marriage to Camilla painted her as someone torn between two men, with Andrew quietly stepping aside as Charles finally won the love he had been denied in his youth. Camilla was cast as a loyal, if conflicted woman, who, over time, couldn't ignore her feelings for the Prince of Wales. Andrew, in contrast, was usually portrayed as the wronged party who didn't put up a fight. But what's now emerging is a far more complicated picture, and one that challenges the romanticized version the public has become used to. Andrew's account suggests that the issue wasn't another man, but rather a transformation in the woman he married. According to him, Camilla didn't just reconnect with an old flame, she changed. He describes a shift not only in her personality, but in her priorities and ambitions. While she was once carefree, down to earth, and even irreverent, over time she became more calculating, more guarded, and increasingly focused on a life that aligned her with royal power. This shift, Andrew claims, didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, unfolding over years, and likely accelerated as Charles and Princess Diana's marriage started to deteriorate in the public eye. As Diana's popularity soared and her personal life came under the spotlight, Camilla, often operating behind the scenes, reportedly became more focused on navigating the royal landscape in her own way. Andrew's remarks also bring new weight to the conversation about legacy, both personal and public. Camilla is no longer a background figure in the royal story. She is queen consort, sitting beside King Charles, wearing the crown that once seemed unattainable. And yet the journey to that position now appears, through Andrew's lens, to be marked by personal sacrifices and complex choices, not just romance and endurance. None of this seems designed to discredit Camilla's role as queen, nor to challenge the monarchy outright. Instead, Andrew's account adds another layer to a story that many thought they already understood. It calls into question the cost of ambition and the quiet human consequences that often get overshadowed by public roles and official statements. The leaked interview doesn't come with dramatic accusations or explosive claims. What it offers is a different kind of insight, subtle, restrained, but powerful in its implications. It invites the public to consider the possibility that Camilla's journey to the throne, while undoubtedly significant, may not have been built solely on enduring love, but also on conscious decisions and a shift in identity. As one royal observer noted, Andrew Parker Bowles is not trying to bring down the house, he's simply opening a window. That window reveals a man who didn't leave in rage or scandal, but who slowly detached himself from a marriage that no longer felt like a partnership. He wasn't pushed out by another man, he says, but by a growing sense that he had become a supporting character in a story that no longer had room for him. In light of this perspective, the public image of the so-called royal love triangle becomes less about betrayal and more about misalignment. Andrew doesn't deny that Camilla loved Charles, but he suggests that her motivations went beyond emotion, that she grew increasingly drawn to what being with Charles could offer her, not just in terms of affection, but in proximity to power, influence, and status. That might sound like a harsh view, but Andrew doesn't deliver it with malice. He speaks with a kind of clarity that can only come from years of reflection. His words don't carry the bitterness of someone who feels wronged. Instead, they reflect the sadness of someone who watched a relationship change into something he couldn't follow. What makes Andrew's account especially striking is its timing. With Camilla now firmly established in her role beside the king, his comments don't threaten her position. But they do challenge the idea that the royal family's public image is always aligned with its private reality. That kind of honesty, measured, personal, and emotionally restrained, is rare when it comes to the royal institution, and it forces those watching from the outside to rethink what they thought they knew. It also highlights a truth that often gets lost in discussions about royalty. Behind every title and public appearance is a real person. In this case, a man who lived through one of the most talked about royal relationships in modern history, not as a footnote, but as a deeply involved figure who was eventually written out of the story. They met in the late 1960s. Andrew Parker Bowles was a rising star in the British Army. He was handsome, well-connected, and well-liked. People described him as charming and confident, the kind of man who could win a room over in minutes. Camilla Shand, on the other hand, had a reputation for being witty, grounded, and refreshingly unpretentious. She was known for her humor, her sharp mind, and her ability to hold her own in a world that often expected women to stay quiet. Together, they fit the mold of what many considered an ideal aristocratic couple. They appeared at polo matches, country house parties, and dinners across Sussex and Scotland. Their names often appeared in the society pages, and their relationship was spoken of as unshakably suited. On the surface, they seemed made for each other. But behind the polished appearances, their relationship was more complicated. Even from the beginning, there were signs that things weren't quite as perfect as they seemed. Friends of the couple have since admitted that Andrew's tendency to flirt, and more, was not a secret. He was, by all accounts, a bit of a rogue. Well-mannered, yes. Loyal in public, certainly. But prone to infidelity in a way that was often tolerated, or at least quietly ignored, in their social circle. Camilla, too, was no stranger to the realities of aristocratic relationships. She understood the unspoken rules of the upper class, how image often mattered more than emotion, and how discretion was key. What few people outside their circle knew, however, was that Camilla had a deep and unresolved connection to another man, Charles, the Prince of Wales. Camilla and Charles had been involved in the early 1970s. Their relationship was intense but short-lived, reportedly cut off by royal pressures and expectations. Charles was sent overseas with the Royal Navy, and while he was away, Camilla became engaged to Andrew. Many saw the marriage as a practical match. Andrew had the background, the title, the charm. On paper, it made sense. But according to Andrew, the shadow of Charles never really left their marriage. In what he has since described as an open secret, Andrew believes that Camilla never truly let go of her feelings for the Prince of Wales. He recalls moments in the early years of their marriage that, in hindsight, seemed telling. Phone calls behind closed doors, letters tucked away, subtle signs that there was more going on beneath the surface. There were invitations to Highgrove, Charles's country estate, that were addressed to both Camilla and Andrew. But Andrew sensed that Camilla believed they were really meant for her. Over time, he began to see their marriage less as a partnership and more as something built to maintain appearances. They had 2 children together, Tom and Laura, and for a while things seemed stable. Camilla was a devoted mother, a skilled hostess, and played her part well in the social scene. But something was always missing. Andrew has described it as a wall between them, an invisible barrier that he couldn't get past, no matter how hard he tried. Camilla was present, but not fully there. She never embarrassed him in public, never failed in her responsibilities, but there was always a kind of distance. Over time, that emotional gap only widened. Those close to the couple have said the marriage looked solid from the outside, but behind closed doors, it was emotionally distant. They didn't argue often, but they didn't connect much either. It became more of a polite arrangement than a romantic relationship. They shared a home and responsibilities, but the passion had long since faded. And as Charles's own marriage to Princess Diana began to crumble in full view of the public, Camilla's involvement with him reportedly intensified. Andrew began to notice changes in Camilla. She became more focused, more strategic. She stopped sharing stories about the children and started asking questions about royal protocol. It was no longer just about reconnecting with an old flame. It seemed like she was preparing for something larger. According to Andrew, this was when their relationship began to truly change. He now believes that Camilla began seeing their marriage not as a destination, but as a stepping stone, something that gave her the social standing and security she needed, while she quietly positioned herself for a future that involved Charles. Their shared life, once filled with laughter and activity, started to feel like a performance. Dinner parties became more formal. Conversations became more guarded. The energy in their home changed, and Andrew found himself more and more on the outside. "The world thinks Charles was the villain in our story," Andrew has reportedly said. "But the reality is Camilla had her own script, and I was no longer part of it." To many, this insight challenges the long-held assumption that Andrew Parker Bowles was simply collateral damage in a love story that spanned decades. Instead, he presents himself as someone who quietly watched his marriage become something unrecognizable, not because of betrayal in the traditional sense, but because the woman he married seemed to slowly disappear. Over the years, Andrew says he stopped trying to understand the decisions Camilla was making. He stopped expecting explanations and started accepting that she was no longer the same person. But what hurt the most wasn't the presence of Charles. It was the absence of the relationship they once had. He began to feel invisible in his own home, a background character in a story that had moved on without him. Andrew admits he saw signs early on, but chose to ignore them. He found letters from Charles in Camilla's desk, nothing scandalous but deeply personal. At first, he brushed it off. Affairs, after all, weren't unheard of in their circles. But as time went on, it became clear that Charles wasn't a passing distraction. He was a permanent presence. Camilla began making more trips to Highgrove, sometimes alone. The children started asking where she was going. Andrew found himself offering vague answers, even though he knew the truth. He could handle betrayal, he says. What he couldn't handle was feeling erased. By the early 1990s, their marriage had lost whatever intimacy it once had. Camilla's connection to Charles was no longer an open question. It was a quiet certainty. Andrew returned from military service to find his wife uninterested, detached. Their conversations were flat. Their shared time felt more like obligation than choice. But still, Andrew didn't confront her publicly. He didn't lash out or seek to embarrass her. Instead, he slowly withdrew, emotionally first, then physically, and finally, legally. He accepted what he had long known, that their relationship had become a placeholder for something else. What Andrew Parker Bowles has now shared doesn't rewrite history, but it does offer a different perspective. One that sees the end of their marriage not just as a result of a love affair, but as the slow disintegration of a relationship built on appearances. It suggests that, long before the world knew the full story of Camilla and Charles, Andrew had already begun to understand that his role in her life was temporary. But what Andrew hadn't fully anticipated was how much Camilla herself would change, not just her relationship with Charles, but her entire outlook. The woman he had once known as carefree and witty was slowly becoming more calculated and, in his words, more focused on the future than on the present. Her evolution wasn't dramatic or sudden. It happened in steps, small enough that they could almost go unnoticed. But Andrew noticed. And over time, he began to realize their marriage wasn't just suffering from emotional distance. It was being repurposed. According to Andrew, Camilla had always been smart and socially capable. But now, she was actively building connections with people in the royal orbit. Press secretaries, former advisors, friends of the palace. She started paying closer attention to how the public viewed Charles, and how she, by extension, might one day be seen. The woman who once made fun of court formalities and royal expectations had begun to participate in them. He recalled how she began attending more strategic social events, not just casual dinner parties, but gatherings that included people of influence, figures with connections to the palace, to the media, and to politics. Camilla, who used to scoff at aristocratic games, was now playing them. And she was playing them well. Andrew came home one day from a military deployment and noticed something different in their home. Camilla wasn't just hosting or entertaining anymore, she was planning. He found folders under her desk filled with newspaper articles, notes, and bullet points about royal affairs and public perceptions. These weren't the activities of a curious spouse. They were signs of someone preparing for a bigger role. She spent more time on the phone than before, often having long, quiet conversations behind closed doors. She started discussing optics, timing, and what was or wasn't appropriate in certain circles. These were not words that had been part of their marriage in the early years. Something had shifted. Andrew began to see it not just as a change in her interests, but as a change in her identity. She wasn't planning dinner parties anymore, he reportedly said. She was planning a future beside the king. This realization hit hard. The idea that their marriage had become part of a larger plan, an institution she would one day leave behind, wasn't something Andrew had expected. He had always known about Charles. He had even accepted, to some extent, that their bond hadn't completely ended. But what he hadn't realized was that he had stopped being her partner in any meaningful way. He had become, in effect, a placeholder. One longtime housekeeper who worked with the couple for over a decade recalled a moment that seemed to sum it all up. Camilla had just returned from a private trip to Highgrove, Charles's estate. She walked into the drawing room, looked at Andrew and said, "One day this house won't mean anything. I'll have a better one." It wasn't said in anger or jest. It was simply stated, and it stayed with Andrew. He didn't argue, he didn't shout. But he remembered that line, not because it was cruel, but because it revealed something deeper. Camilla wasn't dreaming anymore. She was working towards something, and that something no longer included him. Their home life, once relaxed and full of shared interests, became more formal and distant. Camilla started spending more time in London. She became increasingly tied to royal circles, attending events that didn't include Andrew, forming connections he didn't share. Their once lively social gatherings became stiff political affairs, full of carefully chosen guests and guarded conversations. Andrew often found himself standing on the sidelines, quite literally. Once a central figure in their shared life, he was now more of an accessory, present, but not part of the action. Their dynamic had changed. She stopped being his wife in the traditional sense, and instead became someone else's partner in ambition. And yet, Andrew didn't express anger. Those who've heard his account say he speaks without resentment. There's no bitterness in his voice, just a sense of weariness. The woman he married had been replaced by someone else, someone who wasn't chasing love anymore, but chasing legacy. Andrew says he stayed longer than many would have. out of loyalty and for the sake of their children. But even he admits that deep down, he had already started to grieve the relationship years before it officially ended. He wasn't just mourning a lost connection. He was trying to come to terms with the idea that their entire life together had served a different purpose than he had thought. By the early 1990s, Camilla was rarely home. When she was, their conversations were brief and mostly logistical, about the children, schedules, or household matters. Affection had faded. Their partnership had become more about maintaining structure than sharing a life. Andrew believed that if it had only been about Charles, he might have coped. What ultimately broke him wasn't the affair itself. It was the moment Camilla made it clear that the marriage had never been meant to last. That moment came during a particularly tense argument after one of her returns from Highgrove. As Andrew tells it, the exchange was sharp and unlike their usual restrained conversations. Emotions flared. And in the heat of the moment, Camilla said something that stunned him. This marriage was always going to be transitory. You served as the bridge, not the destination. That sentence stuck with him. Not because of how cold it was, he had long stopped expecting warmth, but because of how clear it was. It was, in his words, a confession. A moment of complete honesty that made everything else fall into place. The years they'd shared, the family they'd built, the loyalty he'd given, it had all been part of a journey towards something else. I had given her everything, he said. My name, my silence, my loyalty. And in that moment, she erased all of it. But even then, Andrew didn't explode. He didn't run to the press or demand public sympathy. What he did was something quieter, but perhaps even more final. He shut down emotionally. He stopped trying. And from that point on, their marriage became little more than a formality. Within a year, he had moved to a different part of their estate. A few months after that, he began divorce proceedings. The palace, aware of what was going on and sensitive to the public image of the royal family, encouraged discretion. There were no tabloid feuds, no media statements. Everything was handled behind closed doors. Andrew agreed to the quiet separation, not for Camilla's sake, but for their children's. I didn't want them growing up in a circus, he later said. And so, the public barely noticed when, in January 1995, the divorce was finalized. In 1996, a year after the divorce, Andrew remarried. His second wife was Rosemary Dickinson, a landscape gardener and longtime family friend. Their wedding was small and private, with no media coverage, no royal spectators, and no headlines. For a man who had once been drawn into one of the most talked about romantic dramas in royal history, the contrast couldn't have been sharper. And that's exactly how he wanted it. Friends say that the years following his divorce allowed Andrew to rediscover who he was without the royal pressure. He went back to what had always grounded him, his military work, his horses, and his children. He stayed involved with the household cavalry, remained close to his daughter Laura and son Tom, and spent more time with his grandchildren. Those who know him describe a man who never dwelled on the spotlight he walked away from. In fact, he found more peace in the quiet. Andrew has said that life without Camilla wasn't lonely. It was real. For so long, their marriage had been filled with performance, appearances, obligations, unspoken rules. Now his world was smaller, but more authentic. He no longer had to share his home with unspoken questions, or watch his wife drift further toward another life. He was no longer a background figure in his own story. Still, the public never completely forgot him. He remained a curiosity, especially as Camilla's relationship with Charles became increasingly public. Over time, Camilla went from being seen as the other woman to Charles's companion, and eventually, his wife. By the time she became queen consort, the narrative had been mostly reshaped. The scandal had faded, and the couple's endurance was reframed as a love story that had overcome everything. But for Andrew, watching it all unfold was complex. In his own words, he barely recognized the woman standing beside the king. The Camilla he had known was lively, sarcastic, irreverent. The one on the royal balcony was polished and poised, regal in every sense. To some, it might have seemed like a transformation. To Andrew, it was confirmation of what he had seen happening years earlier. He has said he doesn't hold any resentment. But those who've spoken with him privately say that beneath the calm, there's a quiet sadness. Not bitterness, just a recognition of what was lost. He speaks fondly of Diana, someone he encountered a number of times, describing her not as dramatic or unstable, but as someone deeply hurt by love that never truly belonged to her. She wasn't mad, he reportedly said. She was mourning a man she never really had. I understood that because I'd already lived it. Over the years, Andrew has been invited to a handful of royal events. He rarely attends, and when he does, he keeps a low profile. No cameras follow him. He's often seated in the background, watching from a distance. He even attended Charles and Camilla's wedding in 2005, a quiet gesture of closure, perhaps, or maybe just a sign of his ability to remain dignified in the face of personal history. That wedding, he has said, was the closing of a book he had finished long ago. By then, he had already made peace with the past. But that doesn't mean it hadn't shaped him. Andrew Parker Bowles became something of a private legend, known for what he didn't say, for the interviews he didn't give, for the story he could have sold but never did. For decades, the world had believed one version of the story, that Andrew stepped aside because Camilla and Charles were destined to be together, that he was the casualty of a love story too powerful to resist. But when Andrew finally did speak, quietly, privately, and only after years had passed, he offered a different perspective, one that was less about betrayal and more about being forgotten. In his words, it wasn't Charles who ended the marriage. It was Camilla. Not because she fell in love with someone else, but because she outgrew the life they had built together. Because she started chasing something else, something bigger than romance. She chose a future defined by status and position, and Andrew, in the end, no longer fit into that future. It's a story that challenges the fairy tale the public has come to accept. It's not a dramatic betrayal, but something more painful in its subtlety. A slow realization that you are no longer needed, that the shared life you thought was real was, to the other person, temporary. Andrew doesn't regret the marriage. He has said there were good years, and above all, they had 2 wonderful children. But what he does regret is not walking away sooner, not recognizing the point when their life together stopped being a partnership and became something staged. And perhaps that's the real story here. Not just the end of a marriage, but what it costs to stay in one that's already over. Andrew remained for longer than many would have. He fulfilled his duties, maintained public decorum, and shielded his children from scandal. But when it finally ended, he didn't collapse. He didn't explode. He left quietly, with clarity and grace. Now in his senior years, Andrew Parker Bowles is content to remain out of the spotlight. He enjoys the company of his grandchildren, keeps to his countryside routines, and still holds on to the values that defined him long before he was connected to royal drama. Those who know him say he is respected not just for who he is, but for what he endured without ever turning it into a spectacle. He's not interested in rewriting history, but with just a few carefully chosen words, he's added something essential to it. His version doesn't need to cancel out the public one. It simply fills in the gaps that had been left for too long. Because behind every royal headline is a real human cost, a spouse, a family, a life built on trust that didn't last. Camilla's rise is remarkable. From socialite to scandal to queen consort, she has defied expectation and rewritten her public image. But in doing so, something was lost. A husband, a home, a version of herself that wasn't shaped by duty or strategy, but by authenticity. That cost might not appear in official records, but it lingers in the lives of the people who were part of that journey. For King Charles, Andrew's quiet reflections may be a painful reminder. a sign that the love he pursued came at a cost not just to others, but to the story itself. And for the public, it's a rare chance to see beyond the photo ops and formalities, to understand that behind every crown, there's a trail of decisions that shaped it. Andrew Parker Bowles never asked to be a central figure in royal history. He didn't seek attention then, and he doesn't want it now. But in stepping away, in choosing dignity over drama, he left behind something much more lasting than a scandal. He left behind the reminder that not all endings are loud. Sometimes the most powerful truth is the one spoken the softest. And in the end, that may be what makes his story so compelling. Not because it was filled with twists and headlines, but because it reminds us that love, ambition, and loss don't just happen in palaces. They happen in silence, in glances not returned, in words left unsaid, and in the moment someone realizes they've become a placeholder in someone else's pursuit of something greater.